Hello everybody, my name is Herrera-McFarland and I am a graduate assistant at the University of Wyoming. And today I'm going to briefly talk about critiques, what exactly they are, what a 1NC critique looks like, how it develops throughout the debate, and also some common affirmative arguments to answer the critique. I have also posted a PowerPoint that's a little bit more extensive on some of the in-depth issues and vocabulary when it comes to critique debating, so make sure to check out this separate PowerPoint as well as follow along with this video. So let's get started. So, what even does a critique mean? Why do we use this term? And the origins of it are German. So critique, by definition, means in German, judgment or review. So it's essentially posing a judgment on something and examining the underlying assumptions of it to produce a particular set of knowledge. So, more in depth, what does it mean to critique something? Why do we do it in debate? So, there's been a big split kind of in the community where a lot of debaters would prefer to talk about things on philosophical grounds rather than the actual policy outcomes of an affirmative plan. And this happens both on the affirmative and the negative. However, its origins mainly started as a one-off like critique argument in the 1NC against a policy AF. Because critiques weren't normally run on the AF until recently. So this is the way that it originated. So we commonly think about it in terms of sophistry, and this goes back to questioning the truth behind the reality that we propose to be true. So it means that we are posing the sophist. We are posing a question in order to find the truth. And there's a difference between T-truth versus capital T-truth. So T-truth is something that can be argued around and people have different opinions of it, while a capital T-truth is deemed real, it exists, it is a thing that is impossible to argue against. So, for example, it's very difficult to say that racism isn't happening because it clearly is. That's a capital T truth in our society. And oftentimes, a critique is surrounded around the language choices that we use to describe situations that are happening around us, and really broadly just to describe the world. So it occurs in the warrant component of an argument. I hope that all of you are already familiar with Tolman's model of argumentation, but if you're not, you should go back over that. I don't have a lot of time to describe it in depth, but you should know that it is important to have very specific warrants to the way that you describe the world, and you need a justification for the way that we describe it. So that's a very brief introduction of what it means to critique something. So some important terms that we need to know when we are constructing a criticism, or even when we are versus a criticism. And it's important to know what epistemology means. And while it's a complex theory, it really just boils down to the idea of knowledge. It is what we know to be true based on our own set of knowledge. So it all comes down to logic and reasoning behind a particular thing or event. And what goes along with that is ontology, which is kind of the same principle, but it is the idea that it's a theory of being. So the idea that we exist and we know that we exist because we have ontology. We are constructed out of these ideas that all come down to our essential core being as a human. So think of epistemology as your brain, and maybe ontology as like your heart, the way that we are. And deontology is about theories of morality or ethics. So the way that society has constructed itself around, and the values that it has, the ethics that it presents to itself. For example, our values in the United States are different than the values, say, in a far eastern nation. And so we have different deontology. Another one is utilitarianism, which is a concept that just says that we should maximize the most amount of lives because it promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So, for example, we should save 4 people from dying in a burning building rather than the one person dying in a burning building because we try to preserve the most amount of lives. It's a utilitarian calculus. Next, that is important to know is postmodernism. It's a period of philosophy. So, unlike the other terms that just describe an event or a process or an idea, this is a period that a lot of philosophical writings and criticisms will center around. So, this is a period in academia where we were constantly questioning the truth in things, and this period is still ongoing. There's a lot of postmodernist literature that is constantly being produced. But think about the common philosophers that you know: Nietzsche, Foucault, Heidegger. All of those scholars question the truth and the truth of epistemology and ontology, and that is known as the postmodern period. And you will hear this term a lot. All right, so what exactly is a critique and debate? So I've kind of already gone over this, and it's important to remember that when we're critiquing something, we're always questioning something. So we are questioning the assumptions behind either the language or the way that we've described the world, or the way that we've presented it. And in debate speak, this means that the way that the 1AC was constructed was problematic in its assumptions. It had something in it, whether it was the language or the concepts behind it, that were problematic to a particular group of people or an idea or a construct. And most every single critique will always focus around the idea that fiat is an illusion. So the affirmative plan saying that their policy just magically happens in the world is not something that we should focus on. It's a simulation of policy that is problematic, and that we should actually, instead of thinking about these things in the debate world, we should be going out and actually fixing real world problems. So fiat equals changing the debate from questions of would X pass to should it pass. It's a very good way of thinking about a critique. And another component that most critiques will argue is that individual action is good. We should always find individual ways to relate to the world and go about being, rather than actually trying to have our hands on the levers of power, meaning change Congress or change like President Obama's mind. And it also criticizes that idea of a utilitarian calculus, which I described before. So in my example of 4 people dying in a burning building versus one, say that one person dying in a burning building was the President of the United States, while the other 4 were maybe just congressmen. In that world, a non-utilitarian calculus would argue that we should save the president because he has the most value in society. So it's putting a hierarchy on things. So there's 3 different parts of a critique, and the most important way to think of a critique is just a disad and a counterplan put together. So the disad has a story behind it, right? You have those assumptions that go into the impact, what the act does to cause the impact, and then you have a counterplan, which is proposing an alternative form of action rather than the affirmative plan, and that is commonly seen in your alternative. So let's go over those more in depth. So critiques, just like disads, all have link arguments, and the links are usually divided into 3 basic categories. The language the affirmative used, and you can criticize the assumptions made in their evidence that they presented. Second is the harm areas, so the justifications that they have for acting that their advantages provide in the 1AC. And then third is systems, the way that they've represented the world in the 1AC. Is it problematic? And do they think that hegemonic logic is good? Do they think that the United States should be the unipolar and control the rest of the international order? Well, maybe that's a bad idea because it causes things like colonialism and causes countries to intervene and fight and have massive conflict. That's an example of showing the way that the system is problematic. It's not good in the status quo. So an example I provide here is if you assume that the environment should be protected because of the benefits to humans, that is linked to the critique. Because maybe we should assume that the environment should be protected because of all life on Earth and not just humans. Why should we ignore a big subset of life on Earth, animals and other organisms, right? All right, so an impact, just like a disadvantage, is a result of the passing the affirmative plan or the judge voting affirmative. What major problem will that result in? So critiques usually have deontological impacts, something you should reject no matter what. We should reject imperialism, we should reject racism, we should reject sexism. Those types of impacts are very common in critiques. So those types of systemic impacts that I just named are usually about systems of oppression. And sometimes these systems of oppression can even make extinction inevitable. In the form of a security K, for example, we could say that the affirmative trying to justify an endless violence via hegemonic logic would maybe result in countries fighting each other, and that would result in global extinction because we can't sustain that kind of conflict-ridden world, right? And a very good example to show this is the capitalism critique. So it will argue that the current system in the United States of capitalism, which is the dominant system, is the root cause of environmental destruction, right? We overproduce in order to gain money, like corporations and individuals both do this, and that results in our environment looking poor, having bad pollution, side effects, coal corporations hurting local populations, things like that. All right, so let's talk about the alternative. Critiques always have an alternative, and if they don't, then they don't solve the disad that they have presented. It becomes a non-unique disad. So they usually have an alternative, at least until the 2NR. It gets a little complicated when teams decide that they can just go for a disad, but usually teams will go for the alternative. So the best way to think about this is just as a counterplanet, as I described before, and it is usually a way that individuals relate to each other on a small scale or a global scale. So it's often to withdraw from an oppressive system or to rethink the oppressive structure. So maybe we should rethink the hegemonic logic that the 1AC says is good before we act on any of those before we act on an affirmative plan. That makes sense? Good. All right. So here is a full-length example of a capitalism critique, which is probably the most common criticism today. So first, the negative might present framework in the 1NC. If they don't, they will in the 2NC. So the framework is just saying that the judge is not a policymaker. They are not deciding whether or not just to pass or not pass the affirmative plan. The judge needs to be a critical educator, because a lot of our judges are college or high school teachers, and so they should assume that role in the educational space of debate, and they should assess the assumptions of the affirmative plan and not just whether or not the plan passing is a good idea or not. So then that is an example that would be common in a capitalism critique, and then the link to that would against an F would be the plan upholds the profit motive of capitalism. So we make capitalism more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, so the ravenous beast gets to continue on in maybe a more disguised form, which is more insidious and bad. And then next will be the impact. So capitalism is the root cause of environmental destruction. I've described before what the effects of capitalism usually have on the environment, and this possibly could result in extinction. And then finally is the alternative. So what should the judge do, or why should they vote negative? And an example would be the judge should intellectually withdraw support from the system of capitalism, meaning they can't vote affirmative because the affirmative upholds capitalism. They should vote negative because we are the only ones showing the negative effects of capitalism and criticizing the structure, which is always good. We should always try to resist structures of oppression. All right, so there's also framing. So this is, I won't go into this too in depth. It's basically just impact framing, roll the ballot, and sequencing. So impact framing is just why is our impact going to happen? Why is it probable? Why is it going to happen faster than the affirmative? So impact calculus is embedded in this. And then there's also the roll of the ballot, which I kind of described already. So why should the affirmative fail and the negative win via the judge's ballot? Why should the judge vote the way they do? And then there's also sequencing. So which arguments come first? Is a criticism a prior question to the affirmative solvency? Should we evaluate the alternative before the affirmative? Things like that. So answering the K, there's 4 major things that you should definitely do in the 2AC, and then you can decide which one you think will be the best against the particular criticism in the 2AR. So first is solvency. Does the alternative solve the F? Next is theory. You should defend your framework or your roll of the ballot. Third is offense against the criticism's alternative, why their criticism of the assumptions of the app are wrong, or why their alternative course of action is bad. And then finally there's permutation. So can we do the affirmative in the world of the alternative? Let's go a little bit more in depth. So alternative doesn't solve the case. If the primary way to beat the case is just to prove that if you vote negative, all of our impacts will occur. Our impacts of maybe nuclear war between US and China will happen, which outweighs the criticism impacts. And you also look at pragmatism. You should assess what can pragmatically be done. Obviously, if 2 high school students are sitting in a room just criticizing the way capitalism has functioned in the past, this doesn't do very much to actually change the system and the world that we live in, so you should focus on policy solutions. And then you should just prove why the alternative doesn't solve any of the links that they've also provided. So they've criticized capitalism, but why is them sitting in the room going to change capitalism? Not only solve the AF, but they can't solve their own impacts. So theory arguments, this is usually in the form of framework. So you should debate why the policy of the affirmative that we propose is a good or bad idea. The resolution is a policy resolution. It's a policy question. It's not about the assumptions of the F. And this is the reason we get to weigh our impacts versus the critique. And vague alts are also a theory you can say, like the alternative isn't specific, there's no way that it would actually function, people can't understand it in real world, and so they won't use it, things like that. So offense against the critique, you can indict the theory. So if they are saying capitalism is bad, you can argue that capitalism is good, or you can indict their author. So if they're reading a Karl Marx alternative, you can say why Karl Marx theory is bad. So any theory that they've presented, their author isn't good for a particular reason. Maybe he has bad ideological upbringing, things like that. All right, permutation's pretty easy. So you should always make a permutation in the 2AC. You should say permutation do both, and then you can always do a different combination. So permutation do the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative is a good one, because if we can pass the plan and also question the assumptions of capitalism, why not? Because we can stop a US-China war and also rethink the way that we go about our daily lives in a capitalist society. So if the alternative can do the plan, then do the alternative also works, but that's very uncommon. There's also permutation do the plan and non-competitive parts of the alternative as a double bind. So if we can pass the affirmative plan and also do the alternative, then there's a double bind, because then the AF or the alternative will still resolve the links with the AF still being passed. So that's a little bit more complicated one. All right. So that's my lecture. We will be having a lot more discussions of critiques in the future. This is just a brief overview. And if you have any questions about this lecture or any of the other ones, make sure to tweet at Wyoming Debate. Thank you for watching.